why do people say Sanskrit is a mathematical language is because of the grammar that it has, which is why it is suited for any computational task, including LLMs. However, there are two limitations, right? So one, even if you do that in Sanskrit, you eventually have to transfer it into other languages, right? Which is where the normal language transformers will come into play, and then it'll have the same limitations as any other LLM, right? So which is why, unless you want to do everything in Sanskrit, it's not going to be that much useful. So that's one. Two, I would say, although computation is easy in Sanskrit, it sort of would not teach LLM how to be creative. Because if a language is a little bit, it's like statistical programming, like you don't want anything to be 100%, because then there is no error bar remaining, in which case you don't know what you're predicting. And so it's something similar to that, because it leaves no room for ambiguity. I don't know if LLMs would ever be able to generate a really good essay. It will be grammatically correct essay, but it will not be very flowerful essay that sometimes LLM are able to generate in English or other languages.
Hi, friends, and welcome to this exciting episode of Leading with Data. Today, I have with me Aamod Sathe, who is currently a director of data science at Meta and specially working on MetaWorks. Prior to Meta, Aamod has worked in some of the most aspirational employers in data science, including Google, PayPal, eBay, and GE Capital. In this episode, we discuss about the common cultural threads of these highly data-driven AI companies. And we also discuss how Aamod hires and builds his team and the importance of intellectual curiosity. Aamod is also a mentor to several deep tech startups, and we also discuss the kind of startups he is investing in and how he evaluates them. So go ahead and enjoy the show. It packs learnings from a career spanning multiple decades in the companies which are leading the world into a data driven future. Amod, welcome to the show and thanks for taking time out from your schedule.
Thank you, Kunal. Thank you for inviting me. Really excited to talk to you about my story, the data story, and let's jump into it.
Great. So, Amod, I would want to start. How did you get into analytics and data science, and what was your journey which brought you into this domain?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with. I have to look back many years. Um,
Mhm,
I mean, I think like most careers that span 20 plus years, that
mhm,
it's a mix of a lot of planning, a lot of preparation, of course, and a lot of luck, and a lot of just being at the right place at the right time. To be honest, right? And I think
mhm.
you know I always tend to feel like luck is when preparation meets opportunity, as they say.
Right. Mhm,
So I think what has brought me to wherever I have gone is a mix of all three of them. Of course, when you are
mhm.
in a role, when you have the opportunity, when you have the time, you have to prepare, and you have to make it so that when the opportunity does come, that the luck turns in your favor, right? And so I think it has been a mix of all of this. Of course, I was born in India. I received really solid education. I guess it starts there, and that's where it started. But from a data science perspective, I was always interested in data science. My master's research was in neural networks, for example. My thesis is in
Right.
neural networks.
Mhm.
And this is when we were using 200 tokens, 300 tokens, right? We
Yeah.
could use more than that. We didn't even call them tokens back then, because most of the neural network processing was happening in bit data, right? Like, so it was one
Right.
zero variables. And so but those were about 300 odd tokens, I think, for my thesis. So um, you know uh, I was always interested in it, and then I got the opportunity to be in this field before it was called data science, right? So some of my first
Mhm.
teams were not called data science, although we were doing exactly what we do today. But we
Yeah.
were called analytics, and over
Right.
time, sort of the definition, the field has matured. So the specifics of what you do kind of define what teams. What the team does, right? It's either
Right.
analytics, BI, it's data science. So there are multiple specialities that have emerged. And so I've always been interested in it. And like I said, got a little lucky, and had my educational background happened to be also in a similar field where it was sort of very much specific, and I could apply.
Interesting. And were you, before getting into data science, were you a programmer, or were you more of a mathematics person, a statistics person, or a problem solver? I mean, how would you describe Amod, who entered data science at that time?
Yeah, the Amod who entered data science was a lot less mature than a lot of the new people I'm seeing entering this field. I can tell you that. Like, they're so focused, and that I really admire some of the young people entering this field. My background, like I said, I was always very mathematically oriented. So my background is
Mhm,
engineering. I did my engineering in India. I did my masters. I almost finished my PhD at Penn State here. Um,
mhm,
but as I moved into graduate school and as I moved into my master's degree, I think my natural liking and inclination towards more statistical fields more than mathematical fields sort of just started to
mhm.
emerge. I happened to be in a university that had an excellent operations research program at Penn
Right.
State. It was ranked
Mhm,
first or second in the country, I think. Some amazing professors, and that's when I was really able to shift my focus from what was a core engineering background to a more statistical oriented background.
mhm,
And within statistics, of course, there are multiple different ways you can go. I somehow during my master's itself, I moved more towards the data science, modeling type of work. Like I said, my master's thesis was using neural networks, right? So we was trying to solve
mhm,
a problem for emergency vehicle locations, and we used neural network to solve it, to get to an optimal
mhm.
solution. So I would definitely, to answer your question, I would definitely describe myself as a little bit more statistics oriented, more mathematical than a programmer. Of course, every data scientist has to program,
That's true.
but
Yeah.
I wouldn't really call myself a programmer. I don't think I'm that proficient.
Sure. Interesting. And there are these different approaches to AI and data science, and depending on what time period you look at, some of them have dominated more than others, right? So how has been your journey? So were you always so versus, let's say, a symbolic AI approach to more data and compute oriented approach, the ones which we are seeing for the last decade? How, because you mentioned you did your PhD in neural nets, but this was the era where symbolic AI was also equivalently, the focus of a lot of research which was happening. So how has been your kind of experience and your focus during this period?
Yeah. So first, just to clarify, I never finished my PhD, so I don't really have a doctor in front of me. Just to clarify, um, I think so in my case, actually, my career really started at G Capital, and then
Mhm.
very quickly I moved to eBay, and both of those first early roles were extremely focused on modeling. Right, so we
Right.
were not really using machine learning for some of it, right? Like, I think at eBay
Mhm.
we did use machine learning. Where at G Capital we were using statistical programming,
Mhm.
logistic regressions, and so on. But just from a technique perspective, I would say some of my first roles were actually the most AI, what is now called AI, or machine
Mhm.
learning, like some companies would like to call it. They're definitely more machine learning focused, right? So just to give an example, at eBay, my main role as an individual contributor, as an analyst, was to be able to detect fraud before it does any harm to the
Right.
system. And fraud on an
Mhm.
e-commerce site, at least back then, was simple fraud like account takeovers, and
Yeah.
people being told to wire money and things like that. And how could we detect it? That was sort of the first question. And then
Right.
eventually the question became, well, we can detect it, but to action it is very expensive. So how can we get the confidence levels in our models to be so high that we can automatically action some of this? And
Mhm.
so we used a lot of machine learning for it, and statistical programming, of course. And so some of my early roles were actually a lot more hands-on and very AI sort of driven. Um, but throughout the career, I guess it really depends on what is the business problem you're trying to solve.
Right.
AI is an amazing tool, of course, but it's just a tool, right? Like, you have to make sure you're using it for the right purpose.
Right.
And that's sort of the business problem that you're trying to solve. kind of dictates how much AI approach do you want to take, versus sometimes just a basic descriptive analytics is good enough. It also depends on the leeway of the decision that you are trying to make, and how precision the decision needs to be, because AI can give you a very precise sort of outcomes and decisions.
Mhm.
But sometimes those could be false precision, in which case you actually don't want that. You want to have more broad strokes. So it really depends on the type of business problem you're going to solve, I would say. um, I would encourage people who are just getting into the field to just be very, very hands-on and very theoretical, and very go back to the basics and the principles early on in your career, because as you grow
Mhm.
in your career, you'll have less and less opportunities to be able to do that, because your time gets more expensive, your expertise gets more and more specific, and then you can't really explore the full range. So do it early.
Interesting, interesting. And your current role at Meta, what are some of the focus areas, responsibilities, problems which you are solving currently?
Yeah. So at Meta, I lead one of the data science teams and analytics teams under Reality Labs. In
Mhm.
Reality Labs is the team that creates the AR, VR hardware, as well as a few other things. So my specific focus is on a division called MetaWorks, right? So we are really focused on taking our AR and VR technology and applying it to enterprises and to
Mhm.
business customers, and seeing where some of those applications can lead us to. And my specific responsibility, so I have data science team, of course, that does a lot of the core data science, which
Mhm.
at Meta can be anything from building a machine learning model all the way to a simple descriptive analytics sort of a problem solving that leads to an actual decision. I think the focus is more on driving product decisions, and so whatever
Mhm.
it takes for us to do that, we would do. um, I also sort of represent the voice of all data functions with leadership teams, right? So the data engineering team, the sales and marketing analytics, and so on. And so that's why it's sort of a little bit broader than data science. But data science in general at Meta, like I said, it's a broad spectrum. When we interview, for example, we interview for a broad spectrum of skills, and more often than not, most people would end up as data science generalists. Like they would be able to
Mhm.
apply any techniques when necessary.
Interesting. And because a lot of this interface is, new and still developing, and the fidelity is growing, uh, a lot of times these would be unknowns, right? So the models which you would be working on, so I mean, compared to, let's say, fraud model or risk classification models, there is a lot of kind of context to them, a lot of research already on them, compared to AR, VR, industry and reality labs. Is that how it is? And then, how would you map, let's say, the level at which the data science is, or the role of data science in this reality labs and
Yeah.
the broader field?
Yeah, I think so. Just again, just to clarify, my Meta specific role a little bit. Our models typically don't directly end up in the products, right? So there is a the arc of exploration all the way to in product AI is quite large.
Mhm.
Now, of course, Meta has a
Right.
lot of products that use AI. Just yesterday, for example, we released or announced our latest Ray-Ban models for this year, which will
Yeah.
have a lot of AI in them. So clearly, the AI does make its way into the products eventually.
Mhm.
It typically goes through a lot of different iterations, though, right, which take care of
Right.
some of the early nature of this industry. And it
Mhm.
would be very rare where a data scientist kind of builds a model that sort of ships into a product.
Directly goes. Yeah.
It would not typically happen. Also, I think just from a function perspective, some of the things that we focus on as data scientists are
Mhm.
more on the product decision making, right? So not so much the product architecture or product creation. There are some
Mhm.
teams that focus on that too, but sort of, my team
Sure.
specifically, and many teams at Meta focus more on the product decision making, where we are
Mhm.
really bringing the power of all the techniques. Like I said, that's why most people are generalists. They bring the power of
Mhm.
what they can do to making specific decisions. Like, we made a change to a product. Like, is this a good change or a bad change? How do we
Yeah.
decide that? What are some of the metrics that really tell us whether we should be successful, whether we are successful or we are not? How do we know that we're not falling in the trap of the metric sort of guiding the decision rather than the other way around? And so I think those are some of the things that most data scientists at Meta do on a much more regular basis than actually product engineering.
Interesting. Interesting. And with your experience spanning some of the most successful companies and companies who have truly set the tone in their own domains about what's going to come, what are some of the underlying trends or culture threads which you see in these organizations,
Yeah.
which almost go on to define what these companies have done?
Yeah, I think, okay, so you know without going into too much detail, right? Like, but I what I
Mhm.
can definitely say is, absolutely, I think culture is the company culture is the probably the number one determinant of whether a data scientist is going to be successful at a particular company or not, just because of the
Yeah.
nature of what we do. There are some companies that really have well, if you ask a company, like, do you have a data culture? This, I don't think there's any company on the world that will say we don't have a data culture, right? Like, so
Right.
they all have data culture. Some of them might say that, oh, we are not so much data guided, we are really data informed, we need to get to data guided. Some of them might say we are full on data, and so on. um, I think even within technology companies that at least I have worked at, I have definitely seen a lot of arc, right? Like, so for example, I can call out PayPal was one of the early pioneers of using, and I haven't been at PayPal for almost 11 years now. But when I was there, for example, data was very central to every decision that they were making. I mean, it's a payments business. Payments business are typically very small margins, so that was one of the main reasons. But whatever it be, it was definitely the culture that sort of had grown into a point where data was pivotal in every decision. I mean, I remember, for example, even as an individual contributor, having the opportunities to present at the CEO level. It was a small
Mhm.
company, about 8,000 people back then, but still, I mean, it was very much that type of a culture where, if I had an interesting analysis that was really going to be able to drive an important decision at the company level, I had the opportunity to be able to drive that and be very forceful about it and go against the grain a little bit. I would definitely say Meta is very much in that line, right? Like, where
Mhm.
we have a very famous saying at Meta that data wins arguments, and that is very true at Meta. I think a lot of times, like I was saying, there might be very strong product hypothesis on certain things of what we want to do and so on, and those sound really good. But when we actually put it to data test and it doesn't come out to be exactly what it is, the data science teams have the ability to then go pull those products in spite of having massive internal support and so on. That very much happens. Now, of course, there are some examples maybe of the opposite, where like it was very much tops down and sort of hypothesis driven. That happens everywhere. But I think just in terms of the arc of how important data is, these are some of the, at least the two companies that I've worked at, like PayPal and Meta. I would definitely call out as like really the leaders of how to leverage it, and really putting data professionals right at the decision table, where you can really guide it. So yeah, I think culture plays a really really crucial role.
Mhm.
Your data quality and your analysis and all of those things are really important. But if the culture just is not right, or it's not set up in a way that you can actually leverage those, the success is going to be limited. And so
Yeah.
yeah, so I think it plays a very crucial role.
Interesting. And any common threads on, for example, hiring or how to develop the talent which you have seen in these organizations?
So again, I think yeah. So I'll share my 2 cents. But
Mhm.
hiring has become very, very specific in the tech industry. Like every company has their own philosophy of hiring, and they kind of go with it. Um, Many companies in technology are converging on the idea of data science hiring in a similar vein to engineering hiring, where typically what would happen in most big companies is you hire engineers for a more generalist skill, and they go through boot camp, which sort of trains them on the company specific tools and software that they use, and then you match them to the right roles, depending on their mutual interests with hiring managers and so on. I think many companies are going that route for data science as well. At Meta too, we have always had that route for many years now. As a hiring manager, though, there are definitely certain things that you want to see in employees who will become very successful as data scientists versus those that may not achieve that type of success. I think the number one trait that well, first of all, before even the trait, right? Like some of the basics are given, right? Like you need to know Python programming, you need to know BI tools, you need to know at least a few modeling techniques, you need to have a pretty strong grasp on basic statistical concepts. You don't need to be a statistician. If you are, great, but if you don't need to be, but you need to have basic grasp on some of the basic statistical skills that you will require throughout your life, right? Like what is a confidence interval, how do you derive it, what is a t-test, like, and a few others, of course. um, so those are the given, right? So assuming that people have those basic skills locked down, one of the first things I look for is business and intellectual curiosity. A data scientist's best weapon is questions, right? Like if you can ask the right questions upfront, that is going to solve many of the things that you're going to eventually be able to do. And if you're not going to be able to ask the right questions and you jump right into the analysis, you're going to barrel down a path that actually was flawed at the start, and so no matter what your outcome is, it's not really going to help much. And it is especially important because a lot of times when somebody comes to you, when you start working, and you might be paired with an engineer or a product manager working on something, they might come to you with something that is very unstructured, that is not really a data problem. It's a good product. They're good product people and good engineers, and they have very good hold on those, and they're coming in from that perspective. But it's not a data problem, right? It might
Yeah,
be a business problem, it might be a technology problem, whatever it is. I think your first task is to ask all of these questions to convert that into a data problem. um,
correct.
that's I would say is number one. Number two is you need to have organizational skills. You need to have the ability to build relationships across multiple teams, across different layers, and so on. Because in most of the roles that people are going to work as data scientists, um, they are not the product of that company, right? Let's take an educational technology company, an ed tech, for example. They're heavily dependent on data science. Data science drives a lot of the ed tech companies I know here in the Bay Area, for example.
Yeah,
However, that's not their product. The product really is the educational offerings and so on that they're offering. Same with an e-commerce, let's say an Amazon or something, right? Like e-commerce or whatever, cloud, etc. Those are their products. Data is not their product. Data is really guiding those things. So, which means that as a data professional, you will be doing a lot of influencing, where that these are not people who report to you. They're not bound by any reason why they need to agree to what you're saying. So your relationships are very, very important in those conversations, because a lot of time you will be presenting concepts, ideas, decisions, results that go extremely counter to what everyone had thought, or what the leadership had thought, or what the key decision makers had thought. And if you have those relationships, it just becomes much more easier to convey those decisions, and still be very forceful on what you found in data.
interesting, interesting. Uh, and last, 1.5 years has been largely, you know, defined the momentum of AI, and then generative AI has, stirred the imagination and then the momentum. How has been the experience with generative AI for you, and then how are you seeing this wave of AI?
Yeah, I So I think many companies, including Meta, and many other companies, have been using AI for a very long time, including the basic research, including LLMs for the most part, right? So before
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT became the phenomena, I
Definitely.
think it's not as if many companies were starting cold, and many
Right.
companies were actually very much at the forefront. I was at Google, for example. Google had DeepMind for a very long time.
Long
There was a
time.
lot of AI being built. I think the Chat GPT definitely brought in the urgency for a lot of the business decision makers to be able to leverage
Mhm.
this technology and to be able to bring it to the forefront. They had the capability and it just sort of came more to the forefront. As with most technologies, I mean, AI. First of all, AI is an amazing technology. I think it is the future, and a lot of things that we do today, for example, will either be done better by AI or will be completely replaced by AI at some point, right?
Mhm.
I think we're past the point where it's not no longer a science fiction type of thing. I think we have created the right ecosystem of compute, models, skills, to be able to do that, right? So all of those
Mhm.
components need to exist, and they are now here. So we can build on top of it, right? So I am very excited about the technology, and it is definitely the way of the future. Um, and of the present as well. Many companies, like I said, are using it today in their products. It will go through the typical product curve, is what I feel like. At some point we will sort of go down the hype and we will go into the trough of disillusionment, and then eventually we'll emerge on the other side, on a plateau that is slightly lower than the hype, but still very very productive and will solve actual problems and so on. um, I use, I wouldn't say I'm the first mover or the first adopter of a new technology. Generally speaking, like if a new phone comes out, I'm
Mhm.
not the first one to go out and buy it. Um, so just in that same vein, I was a little bit slow. I mean, clearly we don't. I tend to not use it for anything that is specific work related. We have our internal
Yeah.
tools, our AI, that
Right.
help us. Um, for external, I think, I like to play with it. I don't think it's the most accurate, especially the LLM side. I think the quality and the accuracy bar needs to go up quite a bit. It's interesting,
Right.
but that's
Mhm.
where it is at this point. And a lot more. I talked about the compute, the skills, and the models. There are other fields that need to catch up a little bit before it can really truly become ubiquitous, right? Policy, of course, and there's a lot of discussion on what policy means, what privacy means. How do we protect data when the models want to consume our data? How do companies take more ethical decisions when it comes to usage of data? I think a lot of those things need to come to the fore. That's when we can really leverage all of the data. So, for example, if we reach a point, which will be pretty soon, where there is my personal AI sitting on my laptop that has access to all my data, but it's local, and the compute can be local, and doesn't send data anywhere. I think most people will be totally fine sharing all kinds of data with it, right? Um, am I comfortable doing that today? Probably not, because I think some of these
Yeah.
other areas have yet to catch up, and I don't know what the consequences of those of a breach could be, or an intentional hack could be, or an intentional data usage in ways that I don't want could be. So I think we are there. There are clearly more applications, though. I mean, ad tech is clearly one technology where AI has existed for a long time, but it's really now catching up, and really being able to deliver relevant ads. E-commerce has also used AI for a long time, but I'm seeing it getting more and more accurate now in terms of just being able to predict in future. Just as a consumer, I can see some of that, and so
Mhm.
you know I'm to answer your question, I'm excited. I think, being a somewhat of an insider, I do think the hype curve is a little bit more today, but at some point it'll become trough of disillusionment, and I think the actual usage will actually end up being much much bigger, and much closer to some of the hype that we're thinking right now.
Interesting. And how do you see the life of, let's say, a data scientist changing with these new tools, techniques? So what impact do you see from generative AI? in life of a data scientist?
Yeah, so I think so. Like any other field, right? It will have impact on every single field. Um, I definitely am more in the camp of enhancement, not replacement. At least in the next 5 to 10 years, let's call it that, right? And so, what do I mean by that? I think some of the basic BI tasks that sometimes the data scientists have to do will be the easiest to replace, and we are almost there. I've seen some startup demos where they can do that. What I mean is, somebody in the company has a curiosity about X, right? How were the revenues in, you know pick up, in France in this particular week, what was year over year, and so on. Very structured data, very BI type of a problem to solve. Sometimes it's through dashboards and so on. I think you are already able to be very conversational about it, and the technology will give you that answer in a very conversational style, and the layer behind would be a BI layer. So that is already here. I've seen, like I said, I've seen demos with startups and other places where they do it quite well, and it's very accurate because there's very little subjectivity. The subjectivity is only in the conversational part, which is sort of minimal when it comes to these type of questions. So that part could actually be a complete replacement. But I don't know if many people were super excited to do that type of work anyway, right? So I
Okay,
think
yes. Yeah.
right. So that part would be the one. From a data science perspective, like I said, going back to the skills that I was talking about, I think the business acumen and the business decision making and thinking through of some of the unique problems that are not repeatable. The repeatable problems will probably get better with, solved with AI, and but many problems in business that you're trying to solve through data are not exactly fully repeatable. They need that intuition today to be able to set it up in the right way. Once the setup is done, AI will automate some of the next steps. So for example, let's take a typical product release today. You have a hypothesis. You basically are going to say, I'm going to change the nux flow into something else, new user experience flow into something else. Like, this is the old flow, this is the new flow. A data scientist would say, okay, fine, great hypothesis, but how do we know it works? I want to set up an experiment, and here's how I'm going to set it up. Here are the people I'm going to test it on. Here are the people who will see the new flow. And then I do the analysis that basically tells me what the difference is. I figure out if I have enough statistical power to conclude one way or another, and then I say yes, we do it, or we don't do it, right? So I think the part where a data scientist actually figures out whether you need an experiment or not, can you do an experiment or not, can you in a data secure way, and keeping privacy in mind and all of that stuff, can you do certain things or not? I think all of those will probably be very, very hard to be completely replaced by AI. AI can augment and
Yeah.
give certain information as I'm trying to make that decision, but it'll be hard to augment. I think the part that I described afterwards, which is like, go now set up that experiment, and make sure that you have some sort of a gatekeeper that allows certain traffic to go certain way versus the other. I think all of that can be very easily automated by AI, and that will be automated by AI, right? So that way it will be an augmentation where now data scientists had to manually go do it, or some engineer had to manually go do it. I think that part will get augmented. The data readout again would probably get very heavily augmented, where it'll be almost like a decision in front of me, and then I just make sure that I'm checking everything and I'm saying, yeah, that's the decision, right? Like, and it'll cut down cycle times by a lot, and you can sort of probably move much faster. It'll also try to, once it's coded in the right way, it'll try to find the right pockets for experiments. Sometimes we sort of hit up against limitations of numbers in terms of how much can we really experiment. Most times it ends up
Right.
being an A/B test, right?
Yeah.
It can AI can find pockets for more design of experiments where you don't need to go a
Experiments.
full cycle experiment. Yeah. Things like that would be much more quicker. And so that's why
Yeah.
it's a very heavy augmentation. And of course, at the very lowest level, basic coding that I have to write. I want to write a code to do X. Can you write it for me? That type of thing, which is already sort of very mainstream in technology now.
Yeah. And the final skills which you said, which were the organizational skills, and then once the model is out or hypothesis is proven, how do I go and coordinate the stakeholders in decision making? Any impact you see from AI on that specifically?
So I, like most people from India, I'm not a native English speaker. I did, did my education in English. I was never really someone who would read a lot, or so on. So I think my English skills are fairly limited, I would say. And so, AI does help me today to sometimes make my responses and my answers crisper, right? Like I would basically go and ask, like, hey, this is what I'm trying to say. What should I say, right? Like, should it be this way and that way? Um, Beyond that, though, I think I see very little of impact from AI in that specific skill, right? Which is why I think, people who will be the most successful would be these type of skills, who can really build that. And that's already true today, by the way. Like someone who has really good organizational skills, given the same technical skills, would do much better, right? So I think I don't see that being changed too much by AI. It again could augment, right? It can sometimes, fix my tone and words, and like the things that I use, and things like that. And when AI tells me that, I sometimes go, okay, I didn't even realize that it was coming off like this, right? And now that I read it, okay, I think that is much better. It's not a copy paste, so I would really warn against it. I've seen some really horrible responses, which even as a non-English expert, I can say that, well, I don't think I would ever say something like this. And it's also culture specific, right? Like, which is what, AI might be able to learn a little bit, right? Like, because the type of language you speak in one company is not the type of language you speak in another company, right? So there's a lot of these nuances and cultural elements and so on, which someone with a really good organizational skills, and being able to sort of, coordinate and influence across levels and across different cross functions, can do much better than AI, and probably will always be way ahead of AI. But AI could augment.
Interesting. Interesting. And one of the key skills which you've kind of mentioned multiple times now, and then obviously it's a key skill, is this, you know, taking these business problems, converting them into data problems, and being structured about how you are going through your pieces of analysis, and then being hypothesis driven, all of that. Historically, there have been some organizations who've been really great at inculcating these practices, and then there are other organizations which have not been doing that as much. So, are there some best practices, or are there some things which, let's say, someone who is just getting into this domain can keep in their mind uh, to kind of inculcate those practices? Or let's say there is a fresh graduate out of college joining your team. How would you inculcate some of these things in them?
Yeah. So firstly, I would say, you know, if I can rephrase your question, you're saying, how do you impact culture change through data? Is that a fair
Yeah,
equivalence?
I think it's a higher level abstraction of the question.
Yeah,
True.
I would. Yeah. So first of all, I would say, be very careful if you want to attempt it, because data culture does require a lot of fundamental elements to be present even before anything a data scientist can do, right? I think one of the key in all of this is executive buy-in, like I said, and a lot of that gets set at right at the top.
Yeah.
And everyone else will take a cue from that. It happens in a subtle way. Nobody's going to say it that way. Like I said, everyone says that I'm data driven, but these are sort of the subtle cues that people would take. So in companies, and again, because I'm lucky enough to be mentoring and talking to a lot of startups, it's not a big company problem per se. Like I talk to some startups,
Mhm.
and you know the founders there are so sure of what they believe in, and what they want to go ahead, and that might be true in some cases, who knows, right? Like, who am I to judge? They know their industry better, but they're so sure about some of the things that there's no amount of data that can convince them otherwise, right? So now think about an equivalent of that in each of your individual situations. And if you are in that type of a situation, like these are not the battles that I would pick to try to win, especially if you know that you are in an environment that is not a data driven culture. Like I said, like some of the companies that
Mhm.
I've worked at, like in Meta
Yeah.
specifically, like I would be very comfortable doing that, because we are a very, very data driven culture, and I'm sure other companies are too. But if you know that it's not the case, then I would pick my battles, right? Like that would be the first thing that I would say. And what I mean by that is, you don't want to be going in with the first time you try to change the culture and try to influence a product decision, try to reverse a product decision, you don't want any type of ambiguity, right? Because a lot of times, even with data, like we have to be honest and keep things a little bit ambiguous, because that's exactly what the data is saying. Like we are basically like, I'm maybe seven. If I can give you a confidence interval, this is the confidence
Confidence.
interval around where I think this is going to land, right? Can I be
Yeah.
100% sure? No, nobody can be 100% sure.
No.
It's a
Correct.
it's a data. Most times it's a statistical output, right? So I'm not 100% sure, right? So, but there are other times when I that confidence interval is extremely narrow, and we can very clearly see certain things working versus certain not, and those are rare situations. But if you have those, I would pick those to be the first battles. And So that's one. I think the second one I would also say is, like, in many places where data is not the core culture, data teams are typically would be seen as some sort of cost center, right? Like where they're not really producing anything like that. So in that sense, they're a cost center, even if there's not much, even if the intention is not, there's no negative connotation that companies are wanting to use, they still end up being in that situation, right? So in those situations, you do need very quick and early wins, right? Like, so again, pick what analysis you can work on that has very clear data output that drives a decision. Now, it's easier said. I mean, I fully acknowledge that that may not always be possible, right? Like, and if that's the case, like I said, then that's when the first principle comes in. Then you have to wait for those moments, and pick your battles where you can then really, and then once you have those, that can then become a good anchor to sort of keep making that as an example, to say that, hey, we need to be able to inculcate this into, like, I go back to experimentation, right? Like, such a basic thing, right? Like, when you have a hypothesis, you can never be sure. You experiment, you find out. And especially in a consumer company where you have a lot of data, you could easily do that. But it's not always the case, and there is always reasons not to do it, right? It'll slow down our release. It will, to build the platform takes a lot of engineering, right? Like, or we are going to pay for some external platform, right? It's a cost, or time, or both. And so there's always some reason to not do it, right? But once you have these wins, that's when you should really go down to the product development process, and figure out which parts of that process can data really influence, and so on. And a lot of times it's at the early design, because you can bring in insights from before that sort of inform that design. It can be at product release through experimentation, and so on. And then you take those early wins and you try to codify them, right? You try to influence people who are in charge of that process, right? Like, not the engineers or not the product managers, but the people who are typically in charge of the process, which sometimes can be product managers, but many times will be some TPM or someone like that who sort of decides that process. So you have to go and influence them, to be able to incorporate some of these techniques at the right moment, and showcase your wins to be able to do that, right? So um, I think these are some of the rough steps. Every situation is very unique,
Yeah.
though,
Yeah.
right? And if you have a good manager, they will probably guide you as to how forceful you can be about certain things versus not, because they've seen the implications of in your own data culture, and so on. So yeah, so I think to sum up, hopefully you are lucky enough where leadership is really bought in and is data driven, in which case you don't have to be the data culture change agent.
Change
But if
agent.
you end up being in a place where you have to be, then pick your battles, select some of the early wins, and then try and influence the process itself, so it gets codified, right? And everyone then sort of eventually becomes that.
Interesting, very interesting. That actually brings me to the next area which I wanted to discuss, which is startups and the mentorship which you do with startups. Obviously, you mentor a lot of startups. You are a deep tech startup mentor and advisor with NASCOM. You're based out of Bay Area. What are some of the most exciting areas, or what kind of startups are you kind of most excited about?
Oh my God, that's a very wide spectrum, I would say. So first of all,
Mhm.
it's been an amazing experience, working with startups in India. My focus is 100% India, So I'm both an angel investor and an advisor for startups specifically based in India. That is my criteria for
Mhm.
many reasons. I'm also extremely bullish about the next few years, decades, and so on. And so just want to give back and contribute in any way. But the real heroes are the founders, right? And who are sort of taking all of these risks and really trying to build the ecosystem while they're building their companies, right? And so I've been I've been extremely impressed with the breadth and the depth of some of the startups that I've been lucky enough to talk to, but also others that I've heard, and this is the ecosystem is really at a point where it's just going to be a really high growth path going forward. That's just my sort of thought just looking at it. In terms of the specific startups, I think the good news is that from some of the early days of consumer specific and a copy of something else, which was sort of the start, right? Like some of the first early
Yeah.
success stories of startups in India were, this is the Amazon of India, this is the Netflix of India,
Yeah.
whatever it is, right? So something
Yeah.
of India kind of thing. I think we have come way past that, right? And some of the fields that some of the startups are now taking on are space tech, for example. I'm seeing a lot of startups in space
Yeah.
technology, which is amazing because it's such a capital intensive industry and so on. But we have the skills, the capital is there, so that's one industry that I'm seeing to be very exciting. AI, as we were talking about, right? Like there's
Yeah.
it's such an exciting area. This is where I see a little bit of dichotomy. There are some companies, every company calls themselves an AI now. There are some that are truly doing AI, there are some that are not. There are some that are trying to solve very hard problems that I personally believe are going to be next to impossible to solve in the next few years, right? Like they're trying to build another LLM that sort of rivals some of the most well-funded startups in the world, and they want to build it natively in India. Great, like it's a great, very bold step. The chance of
Yeah.
success are low, but if we are
No.
successful, that would have a massive impact, right? So that's a
Correct.
classic definition of a deep tech. So I'm
Correct.
very excited about some of those. There are other AI startups, of course, who are sort of leveraging the existing technology and building a good product around it. So I think those will probably, you'll see some of those as early successes because the hurdles are less for them.
Yeah.
So AI, like I said, space tech, agriculture, or more generally, I would say food and agriculture, as an area is very exciting. And it's there's a lot of government in this area and so on. So I mean, I'm not an expert on those, so who knows what the impact of that is. But just from a technology perspective and a thought leadership and a product leadership perspective, I'm seeing a lot of exciting startups in the food space, right? Like where it comes to bringing more natural, organic food, that type of stuff,
Yeah.
to the market, or really going down to agriculture and solving some specific parts of it using
Ground
technology.
roots. Yeah.
Right, and that sort of agriculture is sort of a vast field. It sort of brings together, it brings together drones and AI, and it sort of has the, because it is such a vast problem space, you can bring in a lot of different technologies together, right? So I love those type of of solutions which are sort of trying to not sort of pigeonhole in one or another, but trying to really solve a real problem. And so I'm seeing a lot of those, and they're all exciting, and a lot of the founders are really young and they're just out of college, and they're like full of energy, and that is actually the best time, as we've known, as a lot of literature on this exists. Of course, I'm not the first one to say this, but it is really the case, right? Like the best time to find, do a startup is sometimes right out of college,
Correct.
because the opportunity cost is so much lower.
Yeah.
Now, some of these founders do, I mean, none of them have experience per se. They're very mature for their age, compared to where I was, for example. But that is one sort of blind spot that some of these founders have, is that they've not
Yeah.
had any experience solving a real business problem before. Um, but some founders make up for it because that's when they bring in advisors and so on, and they know their blind spots, and those are probably the ones who are going to be successful versus others who don't realize their blind spots.
Interesting. And for a startup which is, let's say building, what's the best way for them to reach out to you for advice and investments?
Yeah, so I hope I'm not opening up a very large forum, but I'm typically available on LinkedIn, right? Like if somebody pings me, I would at least respond once. Um,
Sure.
and then sometimes like the ideas are just not baked, or they're they're very much at a
Mm.
stage of I'm thinking about X, and they want an advice. And, I can
Yeah,
give them a one liner, but really if you don't have anything built or any way to have a product thought, this that's not my expertise. There might be others who are expert at that stage. It's not my expertise, right? So once you have a product going, once you have some data coming in, and you reach me out on LinkedIn, I'm usually always available to at least an initial consult, right? And where it goes from there depends on how deep we want to take it.
of course.
The forums like NASCOM is again a really great forum, right? Like you sign up for some of their official mentorship programs. That's the other way to get in touch with me. Other mentors, there are many mentors there that are really great, right? Those are the forums. I leverage LinkedIn personally quite a bit, and I'm on
Mhm.
it, and I'm typically responding and helping wherever I can.
Interesting. And what are maybe two or three problems which you would love to see getting solved in next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever horizon you want to?
In India, you mean, or in general?
India or AI? I mean, what are some of the things which you really are excited about
Yeah,
in the next decade?
I would definitely want to see an evolution of robotics which is affordable,
Hmm.
right? I think uh, in a country like India where labor has been relatively cheap, historically speaking,
Yeah,
that sometimes it's seen as some sort of a threat. I have always seen these threats to actually turn into freeing up of minds that then unleash a completely new revolution that we are not even thinking of right now.
yeah,
And so personally, that is the one area where I'm seeing some green shoots. Of course, it's a very expensive thing to build and mainstream and so on. So if the whole idea in that industry is how can we make it more mainstream and take the cost down. I mean, we all have Roombas in our house now, and that technology
right.
was like a novelty 10 years ago, but it was an easier problem to solve, so that got solved. That has a lot of AI already in it. Like my Roomba smartly avoids
Maps.
walls and things like that and so on. Right? So there's clearly AI in it. But like we need more evolution of that, right? Like think about like your own personal robot at home that does most of the chores that happen in every house, right? And
Right.
things like that. It'll replace some people, but those people will probably get used and leveraged in a much more creative way. So I think that is one field where I'm really excited, and I'm really looking for that change. I think in India specifically, transport and mass movement of people is I mean, again, I want to acknowledge the progress we have done in all of
Yeah,
these years, and especially in the last 10 years or so. At least I see every time I visit India, there's a huge progress, and so on. So clearly we have done a lot of progress, but I think AI has the potential to revolutionize some of these problems that are super mass scale, that probably don't exist in other countries, right? Just because of our
yeah,
size and our population and all of that. And so I'm really looking forward to that, right? And when I say that, it's not one solution, right? It can't be just one type of transport or one type of we of course we are
right,
building a lot of airports and roads and all of that, and those need to be built. Like we need to catch up to a lot of the countries doing that. But AI could revolutionize a lot of the personal transport and
right.
clean transport and things like that. Goods transport and things like that. I'm very both bullish and hopeful that AI will impact that area. And the last would just be climate tech. I think I'm
Yeah,
not necessarily a doomsday advocate per se when it comes to climate. We clearly need to work on it, and make an impact. And a lot of the previous solutions, like a solution is not going to be super palatable if it asks a certain threshold, above a certain threshold of give back in everyone's personal lives, right? Like, I don't want plastics to pollute the environment, but at the same time I'm a pragmatist who realizes that there is a lot of things that plastic has enabled humans to do that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise, right? So we can't basically say get rid of all plastics either, right? So
Yeah.
being a pragmatist, but this is where maybe there's a third solution, right? Rather than zero versus no use at all versus use it in a way that it pollutes the environment. Maybe there is a path in between that technology and AI will be able to solve in the coming years, right? So this third one, I see we are furthest out. I have not
Yeah.
seen, at least personally, not seen examples of startups, etc., that have really leveraged innovative technology to solve it, right? Like a lot of what I've seen are
Okay.
just you know rigor
Yeah.
rigor.
More awareness and yeah. That is true. That is true. Great. Ahmed, towards the end part of this show, we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions, and the idea is to just know the guest better.
Okay.
So I would love to hear whatever first thoughts come to your mind, right? Uh, so what does a typical weekend look like for you?
Chores, and hopefully golf.
Okay, interesting. I saw cricket, by the way, in your university days. Do you still play cricket?
I do. I do play cricket on the weekend whenever I get a chance. I'm not very good at it anymore. I was never that good anyway to start with, but even compared to my younger days, I'm much worse now.
Okay, okay. Any particular books which had a huge impact on you?
Some of the early books. Good to Great was one book
Hmm.
that I read early on that had a huge impact on me. The Seven Habits of Successful People
Yeah,
was another great book. Rich Dad Poor Dad had another profound impact on me. I'm all just to make a plug. I'm very philosophical, and I like to read Indian philosophy more than anything else, which is why I taught myself
mhm,
Sanskrit, and I read some of the Indian philosophical thought, early philosophical thought, which inspires me on a day to day basis.
interesting. And these are works like the original texts, or this is more like
Yes.
Devdutt, I mean,
No,
no.
definitely not the latter.
Okay.
I love to read read and interpret. Sometimes you need a guru, but most times, if you're
Right.
learned enough in Sanskrit, you can interpret some of the Vedanta books. Like Vedanta Sar is one book if somebody is really interested. It's a little it's probably a 11th 12th century book. I don't know the exact dates and timelines, but it's early Vedanta philosophy. What it helps me do is helps me um, come to terms with some of our daily struggles that we all go through, professional and personal. And it just helps ground you much better. The other thing that I'm reading, because this is my favorite topic, I'm going to plug, and since I have the chance, is the original Mahabharat in Sanskrit.
Hmm.
Is
Oh,
is a
wow.
masterpiece of all sorts of philosophical information. It's a huge text, and
Yeah,
so it'll take you a few years to finish end to end if you're doing it like I'm doing. But every day when I read it for a few pages, there's a gem everywhere. I'm like, oh my god, I never thought of life in this way, and it's just something that I would encourage everyone to do.
interesting. And then since you mentioned that, and then, I don't have a lot of depth on it, but there's more out of curiosity. But, there is this hypothesis that, Sanskrit, because of the way the language is, and then, the texture, uh, by creating, let's say, large language models on a language like Sanskrit, that could be a far more evolved model, or might have better capabilities. Any thoughts you have in that direction, given you read a lot? And
Yes. So in so the so again, because I have the chance, let me explain the reason people have said that, right? Like, why do people say Sanskrit is a mathematical language is because of the grammar that it has. So the
Right.
grammar has a specific set of rules, and if you study the grammar, what you will realize, all the computer scientists will realize, that the way the grammar is set up, it is an algorithm. It is literally like
Right.
solving an algebra problem, right? Like, if let's say you have to derive a word, you start with a root, and based on the root and what you're trying to do, you have to go down a certain algorithm which is very clearly coded. There's
Correct.
very little ambiguity in it, very very little ambiguity in it. So you literally go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, you apply 5 steps, at the end you have your word, right? And that's how the grammar is coded, which is why it is suited for any computational task, including LLMs. However, there are two limitations, right? So one, even if you do that in Sanskrit, you eventually have to transfer it into other languages, right? Which is where the
Right.
normal language transformers will come into play, and then it'll have the same limitations as any other LLM, right? So which is why, unless you want to do everything in Sanskrit, it's not going to be that much useful. So that's one. Two, I would say, although computation is easy in Sanskrit, it sort of, does would not teach LLM how to be creative. Because if a language is a little bit, it's like statistical programming. Like, you don't want anything to be 100%, because then there is no error bar remaining, in which case you don't know what you're predicting. And so it's something similar to that, because it leaves no room for ambiguity. I don't know if LLMs would ever be able to generate a really good essay. It will be grammatically correct essay, but it will not be very flowerful essay that, sometimes LLM are able to generate in English or other languages.
Great. Thanks a lot, Amod, for sharing that. And then that, last part was really, very insightful. And then, I don't get people who I could ask that question to. So thanks a lot for sharing that question. And once again, thanks a lot for taking time out for doing this.
Of course, yeah. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you, Kunal, and hopefully the audience enjoys it too. And thank you very much for inviting me.